Once again, Christian greetings to all our valued listeners and viewers throughout the whole world, more particularly to all Shepherd's Rod believers, and most especially to our beloved brothers and sisters in the United States of America. Special greetings to our brethren in Colorado, our brethren in Georgia, in Fiji Island, Mexico, Spain, in Africa, to the United Kingdom, and also to our brethren in Australia. And to the rest of the 144,000 living saints scattered abroad, greetings. May the good Lord bless you and have a wonderful evening. This is one of the most controversial subjects, but very timely, for this predicted event will soon be fulfilled and materialize this year 2020 and 2021. And it is called the Assyrian Confederacy. And this is our first episode on such subject. Now, reading from track number 14, this is the main reading material that explains such subject, the Assyrian Confederacy. And let's begin on track number 14, pages 32 and page 33. It says, that is, though ancient Judah was not to suffer defeat by the confederacy of Israel and Syria, she was nevertheless also to be brought under tribute to ancient Assyria. And as we shall see, the spirit of this confederacy did not end with that of ancient Israel and Syria. The high points of this confederacy, some of which are still unfulfilled, fall into sequence thusly. Number 1, the overthrow of both ancient Israel and Syria by ancient Assyria as a divine judgment, especially upon Israel, for confederating against her own brethren, the kingdom of Judah. Isaiah 7, verse 2 to 9. The birth of a man-child, Emmanuel, to a virgin, for a sign to the house of David. Isaiah 7, verse 13 and 14. And third, the birth of a son, Maher-shalal-Hasbaz, to the prophet himself, for signs and for wonders in Israel. Isaiah 8, verse 18. Number 4, the overthrow of Israel to occur before Emmanuel could learn to differentiate evil from good, and before Maher-shalal-Hasbaz could say, my father and my mother. Isaiah 7, verse 16, and Isaiah 8, verse 4. So the Shepherd's Rod plainly told us that these 4 enumerations are still unfulfilled. The event number 1, still unfulfilled. The overthrow of both ancient Israel and Syria by ancient Assyria as a divine judgment. So there must be divine judgment, both Israel and Syria, but more especially upon Israel, for confederating against her own brethren, the kingdom of Judah. And we need to have a clear conception. Who are they? The Israel, Syria, Assyria, and Judah at this present time. As well as, who are they represented by Emmanuel? And who are they? The house of David. As well as Maher-shalal-Hasbaz. Remember that according to the upper paragraph, this Judah, by which, as the photograph portrays, did not suffer defeat by the confederacy of Israel and Syria, but she was, nevertheless, had been brought under tribute to ancient Assyria. And that is why it is called Assyrian Confederacy. Who are they? The Judah mentioned here, by which, although they did not suffer defeat with the confederacy of Israel and Syria, but they were under tribute to Assyria. I would like to read first 1 TG 23, page 5 and page 6. It says, the Lord himself warns that he has cut off nations that he has made their towers desolate, and their streets waste, that he has destroyed their cities, and has left no inhabitants in them. He points out that all this he did as an object lesson for future good, so that they as a nation might fear him and receive instruction that their dwellings not be cut off. But in spite of these examples, they rise early and corrupt all their doings. So it is that at long last, the Lord arises to the prey, gathers the nations, assembles the kingdoms, and Assyria gets her punishment. Then it says, from this we see that the Assyria under discussion exists in the time of the end. So the voice of inspiration declared clearly that the Assyria under discussion exists in the time of the end. The time in which the great and dreadful day of the Lord takes place. This Assyria, therefore, is an antitype of ancient Assyria, just as the Babylon of Revelation 17 and 18 is an antitype of ancient Babylon. So the voice of inspiration is very plain that the perfect and complete fulfillment of such prophecy must be pointing to the Assyria that exists in the time of the end, the time in which the great and dreadful day of the Lord takes place. Now, I would like to read Answerer number 3 on page 88. Answerer number 3, page 88. And looking forward to the time of the great and dreadful day of the Lord, the time just ahead of us, the Lord admonishes the people who will be living at that time. Remember ye the law of Moses, my servant, which I commanded unto him in Horeb, for all Israel with the statutes and judgments. Malachi 4, verse 4. Answerer number 3, page 88, plainly telling us that Bethel says that the great and dreadful day of the Lord is still future in their days. Looking forward to that predicted event, the great and dreadful day of the Lord. And the shepherd's rod plainly told us that the perfect fulfillment of this prophecy recorded in the book of Nahum will be fulfilled in the time of the end, the time in which the great and dreadful day of the Lord takes place. 1 TG 23, page 5 and page 6. I think I would like to define the great and dreadful day of the Lord in general term. That is the period of the judgment that pertains to the living. Now, let us now study closely this predicted event. I remember the statement in track number 14 in Time and Chance Solved Mysteries. Subject, Nahum's War Prophecy. So that is the subject. Nahum's War Prophecy in Time and Chance Solved Mysteries. So here in page 51, let's read track number 14. It says, time and chance are still the most trustworthy witnesses, as well as the best disclosures of mysteries. They now give the answers of the questions. Which one of the nations is the Assyria of today? But let us apply the word today, year 2020. You know, from the time this reading material was written in 1943 up to this present time, 2020, it was already 77 years. To number 7, 77 years. From the time this reading material was written in 1943 up to this present time, there were already 77 years. To complete number 7, 77 years. Now, I would like to read again. It says, time and chance are still the most trustworthy witnesses, as well as the best disclosures of mysteries. They now give the answers to the questions. which one of the nations is the Assyria of today? Who is he that does it in pieces? When does the clash of these two mortal enemies take place? So, there are three questions. So, in connection in 1TG 23, page 5 and 6, which one of the nations is the Assyria of today in the time of the end, in which the great and dreadful day of the Lord takes place, or in the period of the judgment that pertains to the living? Who is he that does it in pieces? We know that in the judgment that pertains to the dead, it is Adolf Hitler. But the shepherd's rod made it so plain. In answerer number 5, page 31, it says, page 31 and page 32. The tract does not by name identify the one who does it in pieces. It is pointing to that predicted event who does it in pieces in the period of the judgment that pertains to the living. Because in the period of the judgment that pertains to the dead, Witihotep identify him, and that is Adolf Hitler. Then it says, any conclusions, therefore, that may be deduced from one's analysis of its contents can be only inferential and therefore tentative. From current developments in the European theater of war, it does look as though Hitler is doomed. Despite this appearance, however, Nahum's prophecy analytically fits him. Although it is possible that someone else may yet come forth to carry the prediction to fulfillment. And who is he, that someone else? Or who is he that does it in pieces in the period of the judgment that pertains to the living? In this study, the shepherd's rod plainly told us in tract number 12, on page 76, it says, in these verses, the personal pronouns of the two antagonists, the king of the south and the king of the north, are not traceable by grammatical law, but only by the logic of events. So the two antagonists in our reading in answerer number 5, page 31, the statement says, and also in tract number 14, mortal enemies. And here it says the two antagonists. No, it is not traceable according to the reading by grammatical law. Only in this study that grammatical law cannot be applied, but only by the logic of events. Only by the logic of events, or unto whom such characteristics can be found, then he must be the one. Or in other words, it says current events that may fulfill prophecy. So that is the most important. Now let us go back to our reading in tract number 14. So let's go back again to tract number 14 on page 33. It says, but the simple historical fact that these two kingdoms were overthrown centuries before Emmanuel was even born. Let's read first, page 32. Who is he? Emmanuel. In amplification of this cluster of events, several facts stand out in unmistakable self-interpretation. Number 1, Emmanuel, by virtue of his virgin birth and his name, God with us. Matthew chapter 1 verse 23 can only be Christ with us. Number 2, he was born for a sign that the unholy alliance between Israel and Syria was to come to naught. Third, the lands Israel and Syria, which Judah abhorred, were to be forsaken of both their kings, conquered by the king of Assyria, before Emmanuel was to be able to refuse the evil and choose good, and before Mahershala al-Hasbaz was to be able to say, my father and my mother. So here the shepherd's rod is plainly telling us that Emmanuel by virtue of his virgin birth and his name, God with us. Matthew 1 verse 23. Can only be Christ with us. Who are they, the people by which they can firmly say that Christ is with them? And that's what it means by Emmanuel's birth. And accordingly, that this alliance or confederacy between Israel and Syria was to come to naught at the time when Emmanuel was not yet able to refuse the evil and choose the good. And Maher-shalal Hasbaz could not even capable to say my father and my mother. So, we need to carefully study this prophecy. Now, I would like to read the next paragraph. It says, page 33. But the simple historical fact that these two kingdoms were overthrown centuries before Emmanuel was even born brings a time discrepancy which can be reconciled only by the conclusion that all four nations, Judah, Israel, Syria, and Assyria, involved in this historical action, were typical of four others that were to arise sometime following Emmanuel's birth. For after his birth, Israel and Syria were to be conquered by Assyria. Or in other words, we need to have a clear conception. Who are they? Judah, Israel, Syria, and Assyria in the time of the end, in the great and dreadful day of the Lord, which is the period of the judgment that pertains to the living. And not only Judah, Israel, Syria, and Assyria, but as well as who are they represented by Emmanuel? Who are they represented by Maher-shalal Hasbaz? And who are they represented by the house of David? Now, I would like to read the statement in page 34 and 35 in track 14. It says, so, there's the statement. But since ancient Assyria overthrew the Israelite-Syrian Confederacy centuries before Emmanuel was born, and that's why in page 33, there is a time discrepancy because the Bible is very plain that this Israel and Syrian Confederacy will be broken by Assyria after the birth of Emmanuel. And at the time when Emmanuel was not yet able how to refuse the evil and choose the good. And also Maher-shalal Hasbaz is not yet capable even to say, my father and my mother. Now let us read again the statement here in track 14, page 34 and 35. But since ancient Assyria overthrew the Israelite-Syrian Confederacy centuries before Emmanuel was born, and since modern Assyria overthrew the church-state alliance the Middle Ages centuries after he was born, or the Shepherd Studies is trying to emphasize that if Emmanuel is Jesus Christ, and that Israel and Syrian Confederacy occurred during the Dark Ages, which is centuries after the first advent of Jesus Christ, no one could say that in that period of time, Jesus Christ cannot yet know how to refuse the evil and choose the good. So, it must be in the period of time when Jesus Christ are still in his infancy. So, still there is a time discrepancy. And then it says, logic demands that Assyria, Judah, Israel, and Syria are types, so also Emmanuel must be. So also Emmanuel must be. But we already enumerated. There must be antitypical Emmanuel, antitypical Maher-shalal Hasbaz, antitypical house of David, antitypical Syria, Assyria, Israel, and Judah. And then it says, wherefore, the virgin birth prophecy does not refer alone to the birth of Christ. So the virgin birth prophecy does not refer alone to the birth of Christ. Or in other words, wherefore, the virgin birth prophecy does not refer alone to the birth of Christ at his first advent, but even more significantly to his followers
the birth and development of Christendom. Correspondingly, Maher-shalal-Hash-Baz must be symbolical of another group in the Christian era. So, Emmanuel must be found in another group. Maher-shalal-Hash-Baz also in another group. But more specifically, in the closing period, in the Christian era, in the time of the end, in the period of the great and dreadful day of the Lord, in the period of the judgment that pertains to the living. And then it says, and as he knows only to say my father and my mother, while Emmanuel, Christ in the person of his people, Christ in the person of his people, knows to refuse the evil and choose the good. This Emmanuel could not be the Emmanuel mentioned in page 38. Because the Emmanuel in page 38 was not yet able to refuse the evil and choose the good. But this Emmanuel knows to refuse the evil and choose the good. And then it says, Maher-shalal-Hash-Baz manifestly cannot symbolize any who lived before Emmanuel. So it says, Maher-shalal-Hash-Baz manifestly cannot symbolize any who lived before Emmanuel. Now, I would like to emphasize more this reading because the meaning of Emmanuel, by virtue of his virgin birth and his name, God with us, it says, can only mean that Christ is with us. Now, let us focus first to that statement, Christ with us. We will go back to this statement. Let us read first 2TG. 2TG number 41. Let's read 2TG number 41, page 19. And it is quoting Isaiah 8, verse 8 to 10. It says, I shall now read to you what God himself thinks of it. Isaiah 8, verse 8 to 10. And he shall pass through Judah. He shall overflow and go over. He shall reach even to the neck, and the stretching out of his wings shall fill the breadth of thy land, O Emmanuel. Associate yourselves, O ye people. Ye shall be broken in pieces. And give ear, all ye of far countries. Gird yourselves, and ye shall be broken in pieces. Gird yourselves, and ye shall be broken in pieces. Take counsel together, and it shall come to naught. Speak the word, and it shall not stand. For God is with us. Now, this is the commentary. It says, 2TG 41, page 19. According to Matthew chapter 1, verse 23, the name Emmanuel belongs to Christ. And by interpretation, it means God with us. Plainly, then, the exclamation, O Emmanuel, shows that inspiration is speaking to Christ. So, it says, and since he could not be thus addressed before he was born of a woman and received the name Emmanuel, it is obvious that this association of peoples is to be found in the Christian era, in the era in which Emmanuel lives. Now the statement, take counsel together, and it shall come to naught. Speak the word, and it shall not stand, for God is with us. Plainly says what I tried to tell you, that the nations, including the churches, whose nations mentioned here, and not only the nations, including the churches, that what they are trying to do, they are doing on their own initiative and resources. For the words, God is with us, coming from one who is not with the assemblies of the people, clearly implies that Emmanuel is not with them, and that therefore their work shall come to naught. Now think it thoroughly, the statement here in 2TG 41, page 19. First of all, we need to ascertain clearly who are that nations, brothers and sisters. And whoever that nations, brethren, it is not only the nations that left Emmanuel, but including the churches, according to that reading in 2TG 41, page 19. And that people by which Jesus Christ is in the midst of them are not belong to that churches that is located in that nations. So, we Shepherd's Rod believers, I admonish or plead to deal honestly and sincerely this very important subject, the Assyrian Confederacy. Who is the Assyria in the judgment that pertains to the living? Now, let us go back again in 1TG 23. So, let us read 1TG 23, pages 5 and 6. From this we see that the Assyria under discussion exists in the time of the end, the time in which the great and dreadful day of the Lord takes place. This Assyria, therefore, is an antitype of ancient Assyria, just as the Babylon of Revelation 17 and 18 is an antitype of ancient Babylon. Assyria Church's inspiration is a rejoicing city that dwells carelessly, that says in her heart, I am, and there is none beside me. Sipanaya 2 verse 15. At this point, let us pause a moment and summarize the characteristics by which this modern Assyria is to be identified. You see, it was enumerated. This modern Assyria is to be identified. Number one, as man looks at things, she is so great that there is none like her. She is well instructed in the things of God. Number two, she is oppressive, a hard-ruling nation. Number three, she has polluted the sanctuary and has declared the law of God void. This Assyria, it says, she has polluted the sanctuary and has declared the law of God void. What sanctuary mentioned here? There is no other sanctuary. It is the sanctuary that had been protected in Daniel, that had been trodden underfoot. It was polluted, brothers and sisters. Or in other words, this Assyria represent the nation by which the sanctuary of God was located. And no one would disagree that the temple and the sanctuary is the same. And among the 10 candlesticks, only 5 of them can be called temple. Only 5 of them can be called sanctuary. Only 5 of them can be called woman. And 5 among them never been called as temple or woman or sanctuary. And that is Smyrna, Pergamos, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, Lutherans, Presbyterian, Methodist, Baptist, and the First-day Adventists. For the shepherd's rod made it so plain, they were in total darkness concerning the sanctuary services. To SR 268, the foregoing explanation answers one of our questions. The Protestant churches which were raised up before the woman returned from the wilderness were in total darkness concerning the sanctuary service. Therefore, they are not represented by the woman or by the temple, for as we stated before, the typical temples represent both sections of the church with 2 divine laws, namely moral and ceremonial. 2SR 268. And of course, the moral law is pointing to the 10 commandments and even more directly pointing to the 4th commandment as the sign between God and His people. Ezekiel 20 verse 12 and verse 20. And these 5 churches, they were not Sabbath keepers. They have no knowledge concerning the Sabbath. And not only that, they were in total darkness concerning the sanctuary services. So the sanctuary mentioned here must be the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And that church was raised by God in the United States of America. All these descriptions pointing to the United States of America. The Assyria in the great and dreadful day of the Lord. It says here, she has polluted the sanctuary and has declared the law of God void. Now, for example, I would like to read for SP 398. The greatest and most favored nations, the greatest and most favored nation upon the earth is the United States. A gracious providence has shielded this country and poured upon her the choicest of heaven's blessings. Here the persecuted and oppressed have found refuge. Here the Christian faith in its purity has been taught. These people had been the recipients of great light in unrivaled mercies, but these gifts had been repaid by ingratitude and forgetfulness of God. The Infinite One keeps a reckoning with the nations, and their guilt is proportioned to the light rejected. A fearful record now stands in the register of heaven against our land, but the crime which shall fill up the measure of her iniquity is that of making void the law of God. For SP 398, that is the United States of America, making void the law of God. Let's go back to 1 TG 23, page 6. Number 4, she has piled up wealth by going after it as an evening wolf goes after its prey. She harbors the church of God. She exists in the time the Lord is to manifest His power and destroy all the wicked nations. She is an Assyria-like nation, widespread, a nation of conquest. Then it says, there is but one people under the sun that answers to all these descriptions, and that people is, of course, the English-speaking people. So that is the United States of America, because Europe, majority of them are not English-speaking people. But United States of America, the 50 states, all of them are English-speaking people, in whose midst is the church, that is the sanctuary. But what happened to that church? It was polluted. And from whose midst the gospel and the Bible flow out to all nations. As clear as language can make it, the burden of the prophecy, Zephaniah, is for the English-speaking Christian world. 1 TG 23, pages 5 and 6. Undoubtedly, that is pointing to the United States of America. Brethren, we need to study closely the Bible. It's for prophecy and the shepherd's rod. And honestly, brothers and sisters, accept what God has said. That is very important. Because if we will be twisting the Word of God like ancient Israel, we will not be profited by such effort. And it would only bring damnation to our own selves. I would like to read again the statement in track number 5, pages 55 and page 56. It says here, what a momentous truth today for a sectarian Christendom. Let it admonish all who choose to walk in the light to avoid the mistakes of others. So we need to avoid the mistakes of others, or their mistakes should be our stepping stones to success. It says here, oh, how terrible the thought of closing the heart and thereby turning a deaf ear to the pleadings of the Spirit of God. Think what great sorrow and suffering would have been averted had men not been so hardened in pride and self-conceit. It was too humiliating for those leaders in Israel of old to acknowledge their mistakes and receive corrections from God's humble servants, the prophets. But their ignoring the truth did not perpetuate their exaltation in the eyes of the people as they had expected it to. Neither did their killing the prophets make right their error or cover their sins, nor did it silence God, but rather in course of time exposed their utter ignorance and uncovered their shame before the whole world. Should God's people of this time repeat the mistakes of the Jews, then the punishment decreed in the words, there shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth, in Matthew 24 verse 51, would fail to find in intensity its parallel in any age. A full realization, moreover, simply of the disappointment of being on the very verge of stepping into paradise, but falling short and finding oneself instead plunged in hell, would be enough to stab one through and through with the most anguishing remorse. Track number 5, pages 55 and page 56. And in this study, you can deny, you can evade, but you cannot withhold the fulfillment of the events which is soon to take place in the United States of America. I would like to read to you again the vision that was given by God to the prophet, that America, the time will come that it will become the greatest peril. 3SM, Selected Messages, Book 3. Let's read that America will soon be the greatest peril. It says, America can become the place of greatest peril. And of course, the only protection that we could have is the protection from Jesus Christ. Divine protection. It says, America, where the greatest light from heaven has been shining upon the people, can become the place of greatest peril and darkness because the people do not continue to practice the truth and walk in the light. Does the Bedean continually practicing the truth and walking in the light? The Bedean were speaking evil against each other. Is that the message of the shepherd's rod that teaches us to speak evil against other people? Or in that way, are we walking in the light and practicing the truth? And then it says, the more nearly we approach the closing scenes of this earth history, the more pronounced will be the work of Satan. Every species of deception will take the lead to divert the mind from God through Satan's devices. Now, I would like to read 1TG. 1TG 24, pages 18 and page 19. What is the overall purpose of Nahum's prophecy? So that is overall purpose. So what is the overall purpose of that Nahum's prophecy? The entire book of Nahum. And the only book that deals more particularly the book of Nahum is track number 14. Track number 14. And that's why it is called War News Forecast in track 14, page 3. And to repeat again, it's really very significant. From the time the book was written, 1943, to this year, 2020, 77 years, to number 7, indicating completeness. Now let's read 1TG 24, page 18 and 19. What is the overall purpose of Nahum's prophecy? It is to enlighten God's people of the signs of the times, to make them aware that the great and dreadful day of the Lord is at hand, that the purification of the church, the judgment in the house of God is soon to take place, that the wicked shall not much longer be in their midst, that the redemption of the righteous is at hand, that they must not fail to perform their God-given duties. Indeed, Nahum's prophecy clearly identifies God's people of today under the Assyrian yoke and points to their liberation. Now, ponder deeply, brothers and sisters, this reading in 1TG 24, page 18 and page 19. The overall purpose of Nahum's prophecy is, first, to enlighten God's people of the signs of the times. I would like to connect to you concerning signs of the times. 1TG 51, page 5 and 6. 1TG 51, pages 5 and 6. If the church is not commensurably growing and expanding, then how can she be a living church? And how can she keep up with the signs of the times and with the progress in the sanctuary above? In track number 15, let me read to you, page 5, the signs of the times. It says, the 7 seals, the signs of the times. So when we are talking about the signs of the times, that is the subject of the 7 seals. And when we'll be talking about the 7 seals, let's read 2TG, number 12, page 25. The revelation then is thus divided into 7 parts. So when we speak of the 7 seals, we are in reality speaking of the revelation. 2TG 12:25. When we speak the signs of the times, that is pointing to the subject of the 7 seals. When we are talking about the 7 seals, we are speaking of the revelation. What is the focal point of the subject, the 7 seals? Christ's mediatorial work in the heavenly sanctuary. And that's why in 1TG 51, page 5 and 6, it says, with the progress in the sanctuary above. Now, let us read again the statement. 1TG 24, pages 18 and 19. What is the overall purpose of Nahum's prophecy? It is to enlighten God's people of the signs of the times. The signs of the times mentioned here, I would like to read to you. 2SR. 2SR, page 27 and 28. A large portion of Christendom agreed that we are living in the last days of this world history. When Jesus was asked by his disciples for the signs of his return to earth again and of the end of the world, one of the many signs he gave was, when ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, stand in the holy place. Whoso readeth, let him understand. Matthew 24, verse 15. It is evident from the words of the Master that the book of Daniel contains information regarding the signs of the times and end of the world. 2SR, page 27 and page 28. The book of Daniel contains informations regarding the signs of the times as well as the end of the world. So, the book of Nahum must be linked to the book of Daniel. And not only to the book of Daniel, but as well as to the book of Isaiah. Let us read tract number 14 on page 34. Foretelling to Daniel the work of this wicked power. So, wicked power, of course, that is cometh from Satan. Foretelling to Daniel the work of this wicked power, the angel declared, and he shall speak great words against the Most High, and shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and think to change times and laws, and they shall be given into his hand until a time and times and the dividing of time. Daniel 7, verse 25. As a natural consequence, therefore, the type ancient Assyria finds its double in the power which in the Middle Ages broke up that church-state union. And as that union was dissolved by the present Protestant nations, the conclusion inescapably follows that modern Assyria reaches down to our day, thus certifying the fact that Isaiah's prophecy is correlated with Nahum's. Tract number 14, page 34. So, Isaiah's prophecy is correlated with Nahum's prophecy. So, we'll be studying the book of Daniel, the book of Isaiah, and the book of Nahum. Of course, only to those portions in the book of Isaiah which is correlated to the book of Nahum. Unlike with Daniel, the entire book of Daniel is correlated. But concerning Isaiah, not all of the book of Isaiah is correlated with the book of Nahum. Only some portions in the book of Isaiah by which it is correlated with the book of Nahum. Now, remember, in 1TG 24, page 18 and 19, the statement, what is the overall purpose of Nahum's prophecy? Of course, that statement must be pointing to the entire book of Nahum, because the statement says, overall purpose. And Nahum contains only 3 chapters. So we need to study closely from chapter 1 to chapter 2, then chapter 3. And the overall purpose of the book of Nahum, according to timely greetings, 1TG 24, page 18 and 19, is to enlighten God's people concerning the signs of the times. And concerning the signs of the times, accordingly, the book of Daniel contains information concerning the signs of the times and the end of the world. 2SR 27 and 28. So if we will be studying signs of the times, we need to study the book of Daniel. And of course, together with the book of Revelation. Because the statement to enlighten God's people of the signs of the times and to make them aware of the great and dreadful day of the Lord, that is pointing to the judgment that pertains to the living, by which such vision was not committed by God to Daniel. And accordingly, in tract number 15, on page 13, I would like to read tract 15, page 13. Both seers distinctly declare that the events which they saw was the judgment. The difference between the two scenes is that Daniel was led to look into the sanctuary while preparations were being made for the judgment to convene. Whereas John was led to look into the sanctuary after the judgment had been set up. In fact, John not only saw the judgment in progress, but he saw the whole proceeding from start to finish. Track number 15, page 13. So concerning the judicial proceedings in the heavenly sanctuary, Daniel saw only a part, not the entire proceeding. Unlike with John the Revelator, God showed him in vision from start to finish. In track number 15, on page 17, clearly, then Daniel saw only one judicial sitting. So, do not forget the statement. It says, track 15, page 17. Clearly then, Daniel saw only one judicial sitting. Only one judicial sitting. But made mention of it twice. So Daniel saw only one judicial sitting, but he made mention of it twice. First in connection with describing what he saw in vision. So the first mention is that he described what he saw in vision. And second, in connection with obtaining the angel's interpretation of the vision. And the second mention of Daniel is that his understanding concerning the interpretation or the angel's interpretation of the vision. Here in page 15, track 15, page 15, the student of advancing truth will also note that Daniel refers to but one judicial session. In page 17, one judicial sitting. What is the difference between judicial sitting and judicial session? Does the judicial session and the judicial sitting pointing to the same event? So let's study closely. It says here in track 15, page 15. The student of advancing truth will also note that Daniel refers but one judicial session, although he does make mention of the judgment twice. First in verse 10 of chapter 7 and second in verse 22. This will be seen in the following 8 paragraphs. So the first mention of the judicial session is Revelation 7 verse 10. The second mention of such judicial session is found in Daniel 7 verse 22. And the shepherd's rod says that this will be seen in the following 8 paragraphs. So, if we will count the paragraphs here, on page 16, concerning the book of Daniel, it was arranged only into 4 paragraphs. 1, 2, 3, 4. Therefore, the 4 paragraphs is found on verse 15 to verse 16. And the other 4 paragraphs is found on verse 16 and page 16 and page 17. So I would like to read the first paragraph. It says, in the first 14 verses, so Daniel 7 verse 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. In the first 14 verses, or in other words, brothers and sisters, it utters the impossibility that we could understand completely the subject, the Assyrian Confederacy, unless we have a complete understanding concerning the book of Daniel. Now, I would like to remind again, what is the statement in 1 TJ 24, 18, and 19? What is the overall purpose of Nahum's prophecy? First, to enlighten God's people concerning the signs of the times. And what is the statement in 2 SR 27 and 28? The information concerning the signs of the times and the end of the world was given by God to Daniel. The shepherd's rod says, therefore, the book of Daniel contains information concerning the signs of the times and the end of the world. What is the overall purpose of the book of Nahum? To enlighten God's people concerning the signs of the times. Therefore, it utters the impossibility that you could understand the entire book of Nahum unless you completely understand the entire book of Daniel. Because the information concerning the signs of the times was given by God to Daniel. And not only the signs of the times, the great and dreadful day of the Lord. 1 TJ 24, 18, and 19. And concerning the great and dreadful day of the Lord, that is found only in the book of Revelation. By which only in the book of Revelation, according to track 15, page 13, by which God showed to John the entire proceedings in the heavenly sanctuary from start to finish. But there is no possibility that you could understand the book of Revelation unless you understand the book of Daniel. As a matter of fact, the book of Revelation is a revelation of the prophecy recorded in the book of Daniel. So we need to have a clear conception first, the vision of Daniel. And we explain it that the shepherd says in 1 TG 51, page 5 and 6, concerning the signs of the times, it says, it is connected with the progress in the sanctuary above. Because that statement in 1 TG 24, page 18 and page 19, saying, what is the overall purpose of Nahum's prophecy? It is to enlighten God's people of the signs of the times, to make them aware that the great and dreadful day of the Lord is at hand, that the purification of the church, the judgment in the house of God. So, the subject, the purification of the church, is closely connected to the prophecies in the book of Nahum. And it says that the purification of the church, the judgment in the house of God, 1 Peter 4:17, soon to take place, that the wicked shall not much longer be in their midst, that the redemption of the righteous is at hand, that they must not fail to perform their God-given duties. What is our God-given duties? That we need not fail to perform that God-given duties. Indeed, Nahum's prophecy clearly identifies God's people of today under the Assyrian yoke and points to their liberation. But let us apply the word today, this year, 2020. Then it says, most important of all, so this is the most important. Though the prophet Nahum plainly tells that all these things take place in our day, and that the fall of Assyria takes place while God's people are turning to Him, while revival and reformation are successfully carried by Him who published peace. Now for sure, the pronoun Him here could no longer be beholden, because God never used dead prophet to carry revival and reformation. It says, while revival and reformation are successfully carried by Him who published peace. Nahum 1 verse 15. If we therefore fail to take hold of the message, and if we fail to reform as it recommends, then it is not possible to survive the day of the Lord. 1 TG 24, pages 18 and page 19. And that's why we connect the book of Daniel as explained here in track number 15, page 15, 16, and 17. So this subject is a very broad subject, and we need to connect all related prophecies. Daniel, Isaiah, and not only Isaiah, as well as Ezekiel. Now, for example, I would like to read to you, since this is just our first episode, but I would like to read to you here in track 14, page 8 and page 9. It says, very evident it is that this aggressor power who does it in pieces. So maybe as we proceed on our next episode, we'll give you the concrete evidence who is he that does it in pieces in our days, in the year 2020. Very evident it is that this aggressor power who does it in pieces girds himself for war in the day when the chariots have such blazing lights, powerful electric headlights, that they resemble flaming torches. In the day of this phenomenon, the fierce, the great rulers of earth, Ezekiel 31, verse 1 to 14, shall be terribly shaken. So you see, in the prophecy of Nahum, Bithihotep connect, Ezekiel 31, verse 1 to 14. What is the subject in Ezekiel 31, verse 1 to 14? Egypt and Assyria. So, please read Ezekiel 31, verse 1 to 14, because we will discuss that 14 verses of Ezekiel on chapter 31 as quoted by the shepherd's rod. By which the subject mentioned there is concerning Egypt and Assyria. So, we need to study closely these 14 verses on Ezekiel 31. Verse 1 and verse 2, it is pointing to Pharaoh, king of Egypt. But from verse 3 onwards to verse 14, it is pointing to Assyria. So only the first two verses that mentioned Pharaoh of Egypt. But verse 3, verse 4, 5, 6, 7, up to verse 14 is pointing to Assyria. So this historical event typifying the perfect fulfillment of that prophecy recorded in the book of Nahum. And I would like to read to you the statement here in Ezekiel 31 on verse 5. It says, "Therefore his height was exalted above all the trees of the field, and his boughs were multiplied, and his branches became long because of the multitude of waters when he shoot forth." And it is perfectly corroborating to the statement that only on the earth that the trees naturally grow. And in verse 6, it says, "All the fowls of heaven made their nest in his boughs, and under his branches did all the beasts of the field bring forth their young, and under his shadow dwelt all great nations." So that is the description of this Assyria. And it says, "Thus was he fair in his greatness, in the length of his branches, for his root was by great waters. The cedars in the garden of God could not hide him." You see, the cedars in the garden of God. What is cedars? We know that points to the leadership. What is represented by garden? I think that is also the same in Isaiah. Here in Isaiah 1TG 44, page 4, taking from Isaiah 65, verse 3. "A people that provoketh me to anger continually to my face, that sacrificeth in gardens, and burneth incense upon altars of brick." To sacrifice in gardens is to make a display of religion. So it says to sacrifice in gardens is to make a display of religion, because garden, you will display your garden. And altars of brick, the product of men, not of God's creation, as is stone, are the works of men. Cain offered an undesirable sacrifice, but the people brought to you in this scripture offer an undesirable altar. The one is as bad as the other. And what could altars of brick be if not places of worship which God himself has not commanded to be built? 1TG 44, page 4. So, gardens represent display and pointing to religion. So, these verses in Ezekiel 31, let's go back again. And if you have time, you can read Ezekiel 31 from verse 1 to verse 14, because it has an important role to play in this subject, the Assyrian Confederacy. So it says here, "The cedars in the garden of God could not hide him. The fir trees were not like his boughs, and the chestnut trees were not like his branches, nor any tree in the garden of God was like unto him in his beauty. I have made him fair by the multitude of his branches, so that all the trees of Eden that were in the garden of God envied him. Therefore thus saith the Lord God, because thou hast lifted up thyself in height, and he hath shut up his staff among the thick boughs, and his heart is lifted up in his height." So this is pointing to a very proud nation represented by Assyria, according to Ezekiel 31, verse 1 to verse 14. And being quoted by the shepherd's rod in track number 14, plainly indicating that these events are typological. And one of the verse that I would like to left to you, and I invite all the Begians to study closely these 4 verses in Nahum chapter 1. The first 4 verses. "The burden of Nineveh, the book of the vision of Nahum, the Elkoshite." What is Nineveh? Let us read 1TG. It says here, 1TG 24, page 11. "Is World War II yet to be finished? Saints yet to be delivered?" Then the quotation is Nahum chapter 1, verse 1, and chapter 3, verse 18. "The burden of Nineveh, the book of the vision of Nahum, the Elkoshite." Thy shepherds slumber, O king of Assyria. Thy nobles shall dwell in the dust. Thy people is scattered upon the mountains, and no man gathereth them. Then it says, plainly, Assyria with her capital city Nineveh are the one people. 1 TG 24:11. So, Assyria and that Nineveh is the capital of Assyria, pointing to one people, pointing to one nation. And of course, that is the United States of America. Then it says, verse 2, God is jealous, and the Lord revengeth. The Lord revengeth and is furious. The Lord will take vengeance on his adversaries, and he reserveth wrath for his enemies. So here the Bible separate God's adversaries and God's enemies. Verse 3, the Lord is slow to anger and great in power, and will not at all acquit the wicked. The Lord hath his way in the whirlwind and in the storm, and the clouds are the dust of his feet. Verse 4, he rebuketh the sea, and maketh it dry, and dried up all the rivers. Remember, the word all, without any exemption. All the rivers, Bashan, languisheth, and Carmel, and the flower of Lebanon, languisheth. Now, this is one of the important verse in the book of Nahum, from verse 1 to verse 4. What does it mean that Bashan languisheth? And what does it mean that Carmel languisheth? And the flower of Lebanon languisheth. What is the meaning of languished? Meaning failed to accomplish, unsuccessful, or the synonyms is pine, P-I-N-E, the same. And it is found in 1 SR, brothers and sisters, concerning that predicted event. So we will continue this subject, and to repeat again to all the obedience, please study closely Nahum chapter 1, verse 1, 2, 3, and 4, and more particularly verse 4. Does this prophecy on verse 4 had been fulfilled in the days of Bethlehem? Or when does this prophecy will be fulfilled? Because the Bible cannot be mistaken. All the rivers in Assyria, all the rivers in Nineveh dried up, brothers and sisters. And not only the rivers, but as well as the sea, God make it dry. The sea, because there is only one sea, God make it dry. And all the rivers dried. And the result, Bashan is dying, and Carmel, and the flower of Lebanon languisheth. We will continue this subject on our next episode. May the good Lord bless you, and have a beautiful, wonderful evening.